Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is David Staley. I'm an associate professor and director of the Goldberg Center, the Digital Public History Center of the Ohio State University History Department. And this is the Clio Society Public Lecture. The Clio Society is a public lecture series that connects Department of History faculty to the wider community. We are once again pleased to be hosted by the Whetstone Library, as opposed to a location on campus, which is our effort to reach out even further into the community in which we serve. The Department of History takes very seriously its land-grant mission, and I hope you see the Clio Society lectures as proof of that commitment. If you visit clio.osu.edu, C-L-I-O, clio.osu.edu, you can see videos of our previous lectures, which you can see we're recording this one this evening. And in the back of the room as well, hi, good evening. The back of the room we have an email sign-up sheet if you're interested in receiving notices, information about upcoming events. That's the only reason, the only way we use the email. We're happy to put you on that list if you'd like to sign up for that. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Jane Hathaway. Professor Hathaway is a specialist in the history of the Ottoman Empire and is the author of, among many other books, The Arab Lands Under Ottoman Rule. She regularly teaches classes on the history of the Ottoman Empire, intellectual and social movements in the Muslim world, and Jewish communities under Islamic rule. I note that in 2014 she received the Harlan Hatcher Arts and Sciences Distinguished Faculty Award, and tonight she will present for us the history of radical movements in Islam. Professor Jane Hathaway.
So, the title that appeared on the flyers was The History of Radical Movements, but radical in quotation marks. And the reason I use quotation marks is that I really don't like the radical moderate dichotomy. It was a dichotomy dreamed up by the State Department, perhaps. It existed before the Department of Homeland Security, so we can't blame them. And I don't really think it sheds a whole lot of light on the movements concerned. It's mainly for the benefit of policymakers. It doesn't shed light on the history of these movements. So I prefer to call them either puritanical, which again is a term that comes from British and American religious history, but I think it fits better than radical because radical is kind of a value judgment. Puritanical or revivalist. So the movements in question, it's often hard to summarize them because as you'll see as I move through this, a number of them are connected intellectually, politically in terms of intellectual lineage and theological lineage. But not all of them share the same stringency, what we might call serious Puritanism. But I've tried to summarize what the character and goals of these movements, all of which are active in the present day, are on this first slide. So very basically, I would say, as you see here, such movements want in some way, shape, or form to return, either literally or figuratively, to the original Muslim community, which emerged in, Islam started in Mecca, but the actual first Muslim community emerged in Medina in the early 7th century of the Common Era, or AD. So what does returning to it mean? It depends on the individual movement. Some movements would say almost literally, if not in exactly the same place, been adhering to many of the customs, practices, and certainly the spirit of the original community. Others would say, well, we want the ideals of the original community. We realize we have to make allowances for social and technological change, but we want to go back to the ideals. So how do you get there? Usually with all the movements I'm going to cover today, it involves some form of Sharia law, and what exactly makes up the Sharia is sometimes hard to put a finger on. There is no one document that can be called the Sharia. It's a combination of legal rulings found in the Quran, the scripture of Islam, sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and the legal decisions of the first generation after the Prophet, give or take. So the collectivity of legal decisions from those sources. So, which governed the original community in Medina. Some form of Sharia law, either complemented by other forms of law or not. Rooting out innovations to the Prophet Muhammad's practice. That's a key element in most of these movements. Bad innovations, that is. The extent to which these movements allow innovations like technological innovations, social innovations like constitutions and that kind of thing differs from movement to movement. This is where the puritanical part comes in, because particularly with movements like the Wahhabis, al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State, you do really find an emphasis on rooting out almost all innovations, which they see as negative, particularly religious and social innovations. So that's the puritanical part of it. A movement like the Muslim Brotherhood stresses more recapturing the ideals of the original community without really trying to duplicate the conditions. So in that sense, it's more revivalist or even reformist. And you could say, you know, I often ask my undergraduate students, what is the difference between Puritanism and reformism? Aren't these movements all reformist? They want to reform Islam, they want to reform the community. So there's no easy answer. You could say yes, you could also say no. With the label radical usually goes the assumption that these movements are violent. Some of them are. They want to implement this agenda by means of violence, not in all cases for the sake of violence, but because it quickens the agenda. It speeds up the chances of accomplishing it. This is not always true, though. The Muslim Brotherhood in particular, which started out as a movement that was willing to use certain violent means to accomplish its agenda, later renounced violence. The movements I'm going to go over this evening are all Sunni. There are Shiite so-called radical movements, but Shiite revivalist movements tend to have a different agenda. So I save that for another talk, let's say. And to put this in some kind of historical context, although the movements I'm going to talk about today are modern, and the tendencies that they are drawing on are modern tendencies. These are not things that have existed since time immemorial. The idea of purifying the community and of going back to the ideals of the Prophet, that's been around for quite a long time in some way, shape, or form, and we can identify this kind of purifying or revivalist movement all the way back in the 11th century CE, and that's among Sunnis alone. This doesn't mean that these current movements are simply a retread of the 11th century, but there is a tendency, because the original community is this ideal, and because Muhammad was both a religious and a political leader, the goal of going back to the original community in some way, shape, or form, or having today's community emulate the original community, is always in the background, or there's always the potential for it to arise as a goal. So what the four movements I'm going to cover tonight, more or less in chronological order: the Wahhabi movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State. And the interesting thing is how they're connected, particularly the latter three. Very different movements, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood as opposed to the other two, but intellectually and theologically connected. So like a good historian, I'm going to start with the earliest one, the Wahhabis. Wahhabism today is the official theology of Saudi Arabia. It goes back to the late 18th century. So really it is a modern movement. If we think of the late 18th century as when the modern era starts, I'm a little bit uncomfortable saying that, but it's not something that has been around since the beginning of Islam. So how did it start? It starts out in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, when this whole area, virtually everything you see on the map except for Iran and Ethiopia, were under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. You know, my favorite empire. But The Ottomans nominally ruled the interior of the peninsula. In actual fact, they didn't really exert much control over it. It was kind of no man's land. The tribes in the interior pretty much did what they wanted. The Ottomans couldn't even collect taxes. They were one of history's great tax collecting empires, but in that territory, it was often just better not even to try. So it starts out, the Wahhabi name comes from a man named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, given name Muhammad. This is his father's name, Abdul Wahhab. And he was a judge, a scholar in this central region. And like many people in this rather backwoodsy, I would say backwoodsy, except there's no woods, so back deserty region, he went to the major Islamic centers seeking knowledge, not just Mecca and Medina, but also in Iraq. And he seems from a very early stage in his career to have had a conception of the proper form of Islam as being something quite different from what the Ottoman state endorsed. In fact, he did not see the Ottomans as legitimate in any way, shape, or form, and this was something new. In Mecca and Medina, the indigenous leaders running those cities were loyal to the Ottoman Sultan. They paid tribute, they handled the pilgrimage every year. Not Ibn Abdul Wahhab. The more he studied, even though he was studying within the Ottoman Empire, the more convinced he became that the Ottoman Sultan really was not a proper Muslim, and certainly should not be the caliph. He was recognized as the caliph, the leader of the world's Sunni Muslims. Ibn Abdul Wahhab thought that this was not the right thing. So his conception of proper Sunni Islam was this very, very rigorous, austere, almost original community-like Islam. He very much wanted to spread this idea of purified Islam, but the problem was he was, we academics always have this problem, right? He was just a scholar. Nobody's going to listen to one scholar, even if he has other scholars who agree with him. That's not going to get him very far. The big break comes when he teams up with a tribal chieftain in the region, the original Saudi, Muhammad ibn Saud, who adopts Wahhabism. Of course, it wasn't called Wahhabism at the time. And then in the mid-18th century, they start spreading this new faith militarily with the help of Ibn Saud's tribal army through the Arabian Peninsula. And they find that in this kind of backwater, another misnomer, backwoods, backwater, back desert, there are a lot of people who were never living in communities that were never properly Islamized in the first place. I mean, they identify as Muslims, but they still are hanging on to some old pre-Islamic, what the politically incorrect term would be pagan practices, like worshiping groves of trees and things like that. So in the process, many of these ancient communities are really Islamized for the first time. So what does this mean for Ibn Abdul Wahhab and the Saudis? Because now they're a team. First of all, when they do this, they are not doing this on behalf of the Ottomans. It's a rebellion. They don't recognize the Ottoman Sultan. The territory they conquer is taken out of Ottoman control. It was really out of Ottoman control de facto anyway, but now it's really out of Ottoman control. And they're expanding. By the end of the 18th century, they are threatening Mecca and Medina, the holy cities of Islam, from which the Ottoman Sultan derives a huge amount of prestige because he's the custodian. He rules them, he handles the pilgrimage traffic from other parts of the empire, from the whole world, really, to Mecca every year. The unthinkable happens when the Wahhabis and Saudis actually managed to occupy Mecca and Medina in 1803 and 1805, respectively. There's an Egyptian chronicler who describes this. He doesn't actually go there, but he hears reports from pilgrims who are coming back about the restrictions they put on the pilgrimage caravan and what the Wahhabis look like. There are also European observers who see them. One of the European observers in particular, a Swiss adventurer, John Louis Burckhardt, or Jakob Louis Burckhardt, Johann Louis Ludwig Burckhardt, the way he describes them, it really sounds eerily like the Islamic State fighters coming into Mosul. He says, then thousands of them came into Medina, and they were all men, but what men? And they're like ragged and wearing this pilgrim's garb. And they're just very, almost fanatical. They really want to wipe out all innovations, and that includes, by the way, coffee, which originated in Yemen, actually Ethiopia, but came into the Ottoman Empire from Yemen in the 16th century. Tobacco, which came from the New World, right about the same time. Heretical innovations. Mysticism, or Sufism, which they are dead set against. And a frequent part of Sufism, visiting, even making pilgrimages to the tombs of dead Sufi leaders, who are often regarded as like kind of informal saints. This kind of thing, visiting the tombs of deceased leaders, up to and including the Prophet Muhammad himself, is something the Wahhabis can't stand, because they believe, you're not worshiping God. We're supposed to worship God. Instead, you're worshiping this guy in a tomb, and he's just a human being who's dead. They even wanted to destroy Muhammad's tomb in Medina for that same reason. And they came really, really close, but did not do it. The person who saved the day for the Ottomans was the governor of Egypt, who had his own little autonomy thing going, but at least recognized the Sultan, paid lip service to the Sultan. So Egypt had always been like the strike force for Mecca and Medina. They sent the biggest pilgrimage caravan every year. So the autonomous governor sent his armies and became a hero for the Ottomans, and of course just laid the ground for his own later invasion of Syria. No one was expecting that, but he did drive them out. So the Wahhabis and the Saudis fell back into the peninsula. They did take over Riyadh, which at the time was just this little village. But then they were even driven out of there by a rival tribe and ended up limping all the way back to what is now Kuwait. But they weren't done yet. Fast forward to the early 20th century. This is when they come back after kind of being around and building themselves back up after that defeat. And this is when they are wildly successful under the leadership of this man, Ibn Saud. This is the same Ibn Saud who met with Roosevelt on a ship in the Bitter Lakes in Egypt, and who is the father of the last, God knows how many Saudi kings. He had an enormous number of children, and we're kind of still working our way through his children, through one branch of his children, actually. So this is the entire Saudi monarchy right here, still working through the generation of his children. He's really an incredible political strategist. He completely regains all the Saudis' territory, retakes Riyadh, takes over the holy cities for good and all, at least so far, in the 1920s, and declares the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, he's still aligned with the Wahhabis, but whereas back in the 18th century, the Wahhabis were really the dominant party in that partnership, here, it's the Saudis who are the dominant partner. And yet, the ideology is very strong. Ibn Saud is willing to be pragmatic, but when he founds this kingdom, he's making a concession to political realities. Kingdom is something it's a European idea. What he really wanted was a kind of idealistic, utopian even, Muslim agricultural society. And he does manage to found that, but as a concession mainly to the imperial power in the region, Britain, he does declare a kingdom and is recognized as a king. And he himself, his forces have that same anti-tomb worshipping ideology that their ancestors did. This is a photograph of one of the big cemeteries in Mecca where luminaries of early Islamic history, not Muhammad, he's buried in Medina, but some of his relatives, his early followers are buried, and there are their tombs before Ibn Saud and company came through. After they came through, there was nothing left. They destroyed them all. He wanted to destroy the Prophet's tomb in Medina, but was persuaded that, it might be a good thing to keep it standing. For one thing, when Muslims make the pilgrimage, they often make a side trip to Medina to visit the tomb. So if nothing else, it's a revenue source. I mean, you don't pay to visit the tomb, but of course there are lots of, like any attraction of that kind, there are all kinds of shops and things in the vicinity. So Wahhabism is very much the ideology of Ibn Saud, and it's still the official ideology of Saudi Arabia. And what many people don't really recognize is that the Saudis, I guess you could call this soft diplomacy or soft proselytism, they really do try to spread this ideology. Not so much through bludgeoning it into people, because that never works, but the way that really works, money, of which they have a lot. So throughout the region, and not just the Middle East, but places like Bosnia, certainly Afghanistan, the Indian subcontinent, Albania, Kosovo, etc., they're there with money, building mosques, building schools, development aid that has mosques and schools along with it, that instills this ideology. And it's been very effective for them. More recently, the new king, Salman, who took office just last year, has adopted, rather surprisingly, a very, very aggressive foreign policy. In particular, his air force has really bombed the heck out of Yemen. We don't usually hear that much about the attacks in Yemen, but the destruction has been almost unreal. It's been in 1 year on about the level of Syria in 5 years. And he's responsible for casting the war in Yemen in very sectarian terms. Sunni, i.e. the Yemeni government, which he is supporting against the Shiite Houthi movement, which, well, that's a whole other story, but it doesn't necessarily need to be seen in such short terms, let me put it that way. Okay, so that is the Saudis and the Wahhabis. Now for something completely different, that maybe not. The Muslim Brotherhood. Apart from the Wahhabis, it's one of the most enduring Muslim revivalist movements out there. It's founded in 1928 in Egypt by a primary school teacher, so not a judge, not even a traditional Muslim cleric sort of a person, but a primary school teacher who's had some Western-style education. His name was Hassan al-Banna. And his program is rather different from that of the Wahhabis. He's certainly pro-Sharia. He does want to implement Islamic law. He does want to root out harmful innovations, but I think it's fair to call him a reformist. He has a whole reform agenda that he writes down and presents to the king of Egypt. So he's not puritanical in the way that the Wahhabis are. And he's certainly not rejectionist. He doesn't just want to throw over the Egyptian society of his time and replace it with something else. In fact, he very much wants to work within the system, or so it seems, because the way he goes about trying to implement his ideals is to write up this lengthy reform program and present it to the new king in 1936, King Farouk. Some of you may be old enough to remember when King Farouk was in power. He was deposed in the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, and then he went into exile on the Riviera and got very, very, very fat. Here he is in his Godfather style. So just a few highlights of this reform proposal. I actually have a hard copy in English translation here from an old primary source reader. It's kind of amazing in how liberal reformists, liberal in the, not even the 19th century sense, but the 20th century sense it is. There are various planks in it that really have nothing to do with Islamic Puritanism. He calls for an end to political parties. Instead, he wants a united front, kind of like what Nasser would ultimately put in place, except Nasser's version was secular. He does want to impose Islamic conduct. There's a clause about school teachers should even be kind of watched to make sure that they behave the right way when they're at home. Kind of like Brigham Young University, I have to say. Rooting out foreign influence. This is a time when Egypt is really under the thumb of the British. And that's the kind of foreign influence he wants to root out. He says, we should use Arabic. The upper classes in Egypt at the time spoke French a whole lot because there had been tremendous French influence, though not colonial rule, in the early 20th century. English was still an important administrative language. So his take is we should get rid of that and go to Arabic. We should remember that we are Egyptian. It was not so much Arab nationalist as Egyptian nationalist. So we really should Egyptianize our institutions. And then there's this whole social justice agenda that his manifesto includes. Things that you look for in vain in the Wahhabi agenda. Expanding literacy. He has a whole section on the problem of women, or the issue of women. To find a solution for the problems of women, not that they're a problem, but the problems that they face. A solution that will allow her, meaning the woman, to progress, and which will protect her while conforming to Islamic principles. So to him, this included education and jobs for women. Now, okay, not electrical engineering or anything like that, but school teachers, librarians, nurses, the usual women's jobs. Other things that are very much part of the social justice agenda: public health, jobs, support for the labor movement, and workers' rights. So this is a reformist agenda. It's not going back to the exact conditions of the original Muslim community. But as far as al-Banna was concerned, it was consistent with the spirit of the original community, because he saw the Prophet Muhammad as a social justice figure. Al-Banna was assassinated in 1949. It was a period when the Brotherhood was willing to use assassination themselves, and then government forces under the monarchy turned around and assassinated al-Banna. So the next big turning point in the Muslim Brotherhood's history comes in the 1960s, when it is heavily influenced by the ideology of Sayyid Qutb, who was never a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was just a member, but his ideas, which are widely available on the internet, are very, very, have had a huge effect not just on the Brotherhood, but on other Islamist movements. So at this point, about a decade before his writings start to be disseminated in the 1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood is under attack by Gamal Abdel Nasser's secular militaristic regime. He's the army colonel who takes over the government after the 1952 revolution. There's an assassination attempt on him by a Brotherhood member, and it's a dramatic escape. He's giving a speech under a light bulb, a shot rings out, the light bulb breaks, but he is spared. So this is like a miracle, and it gives him carte blanche to really crack down on the Brotherhood and imprison all their leaders and anyone who's important ideologically, very much including Sayyid Qutb. You see here, they have this really humiliating practice in the Egyptian courts when they're trying such people of putting everybody in a great big cage, even back then. So here's Sayyid Qutb in one of these cages. And he is actually executed in 1966 on the charge of plotting to assassinate Nasser. So he writes most of his works while he's languishing in Nasser's prison. And the works live on after him and are still widely circulating today. It's a very different kind of take from Hassan al-Banna. It's more, I guess you could say, more akin to Wahhabism. So his idea is that there is a contract, kind of like the contract that, according to our Constitution in the United States, the government has with the public. You can't just be a dictator. The ruler is bound, whoever it is, whether it's a military figure or someone elected or a king or an emperor, he is bound to govern by the Sharia. If he doesn't, if he's corrupt, then he can be overthrown. He introduces the idea of what he calls the realm of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is a word that is usually taken to mean the state of affairs in the Arabian Peninsula before Islam arose, when tribal warfare and blood feuds were everything. It's usually translated as ignorant. And he talks about a whole realm of Jahiliyyah, like outside the realm of Islam are people who belong to that realm of pre-Islamic ignorance. And it includes people who call themselves Muslims but are really corrupt and un-Islamic, like Nasser. Nasser is the obvious candidate. It also, and this is a new thing, really new, we've not seen it beforehand, it includes non-Muslims, and he introduces the idea, which really has no precedent in Sunni Islam that I know about, that contact with them is polluting. That's something that you see more in Twelver Shi'ism. He also introduced, so this has great resonance, it still resonates today among so-called radical groups. Another of his ideas that has similar resonance is the idea that it's acceptable to adopt high tech. And in his day it would have been things like radios and some planes, machine guns from the West, but not to adopt Western social innovations. So I think it's pretty obvious this has great resonance. So Sayyid Qutb is hanged in 1966. Nasser dies of a heart attack in 1970. He's succeeded by Anwar Sadat. And Sadat is assassinated, as you may recall, in 1981 while reviewing a military parade by members of a group calling itself the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. It was a violent offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The mainstream Muslim Brotherhood disavowed it, in fact. But it had its roots in people who were dissatisfied with the Brotherhood. So after the assassination, Egyptian Islamic Jihad splits into two. The upper Egyptians, people from the south of Egypt, the upper courses of the Nile, form the Islamic group, and they are behind the first World Trade Center bombing back in 1993. Remember that? Killed only 6 people. The mastermind of that attack was the blind Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman, who was serving a life sentence in Brooklyn. Meanwhile, so they're the upper Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Cairo contingent retains the name as Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and their leader is Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current head of al-Qaeda. I'll get back to him in a minute. So just an epilogue of the Brotherhood. After the 2011 Arab Spring Revolution, Egypt had parliamentary elections, and a party linked to the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections as well as the presidential election. They elected Mohammed Morsi, a Brotherhood member, but never its leader or anything like that, as their president. He had a troubled term for 2 years and then was overthrown in the July 2013 military coup. He's in jail now. He's shown here in one of those courtroom cages, and has been sentenced to death in the past year. The sentence is now being appealed, so he's still languishing in jail, and Egypt has a new military dictator, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Final word on the Muslim Brotherhood: they do exist outside Egypt. They moved into Syria and Jordan in the 1950s. In Syria, they've been outlawed for decades. In Jordan, very different story. They're actually a political party, the Islamic Action Front, which does have representation in Jordan's parliament. And in the Palestinian territories, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood branch in the Palestinian territories, founded in 1987. Okay, I'm speeding up a little bit. Al-Qaeda. What you'll notice about Al-Qaeda is that it seems to start with disgruntled members of the Muslim Brotherhood, people who think that the Muslim Brotherhood is not moving fast enough and is to work within the system. The ideological grandfather of Al-Qaeda and the coiner of the name appears to have been the late Abdullah Azzam. He was a Palestinian who joined the Jordanian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 50s, but was kind of dissatisfied with how go slow it was. You know, you try and participate in elections, you work within the system, you don't resort to violence. He goes on the Hajj in the 1970s, well actually the 80s, after the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan, and he meets another Muslim Brotherhood member who tells him the future of jihad is not in Jordan or Egypt or Syria, it's in Afghanistan. He takes this seriously and he leaves Jordan and goes to Pakistan and Afghanistan. There, the Afghan Mujahideen, the resistance fighters, are battling the Soviets. And what al-Azam does is to set up Arab units. The Mujahideen are Afghan, they don't speak Arabic. He sets up Arab units alongside them. So he does this, he has his own bureau for Arabs coming in who want to fight. It's like the Spanish Civil War for these guys. They all want to fight because it's against the Soviets. And in 1989, he's assassinated in circumstances that are still unclear. No one can figure out who killed him. There are multiple suspects, including none other than Ayman al-Zawahiri, who did not really agree with him. But it could have been the Soviets, it could have been someone in Afghanistan, it could have been the CIA, it could have been another branch of al-Qaeda. So, how he shapes al-Qaeda's ideology. He really, as you see here, redefines what jihad is all about. It's not about overthrowing a corrupt regime like Nasser or Mubarak or the Soviet puppet leader of Afghanistan. Instead, he sees it as a global reconquest of territory formerly ruled by Muslims, even if it were back in the Middle Ages. And so the way you do this, it's different from overthrowing a corrupt government. You're not a revolutionary cell. What you're doing, you're an army of reconquest. And you have to start out from what he calls a solid base. And that's where the word al-Qaeda comes from. It's the base. Al-Qaeda al-Sulba, the solid base. So he himself seems not to be interested in terrorist tactics, bombs and flying planes into buildings and things. He seems to be more concerned with guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan in particular. He does, however, believe in martyrdom, that if you die in this kind of reconquest jihad, you will go straight to paradise, etc. And that really has not been a going concern among Sunnis as opposed to Shiites up to this point. But he really starts to spread that idea. Now we get to Zawahiri. He is by training a medical doctor. And early on, became fond of his signature gesture, the upraised index finger. In virtually every photograph you see of him on the web, he is making a point. So he's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood from a very early age. He joins when he's only 14 years old. He's very, very inspired by Sayyid Qutb, but rather like Azam in Jordan, he's disillusioned. The Muslim Brotherhood is so slow. It's all work within the system, try and get the government to agree to let you run for parliament, and then maybe we can pass some laws. And it's just way too slow. He's thinking, if we do this, we're never going to see any kind of Sharia-run state in our lifetimes. So the last straw is when Sayyid Qutb is executed by Nasser in 1966, and so Zawahiri decides no more Muslim Brotherhood. He goes out and forms a revolutionary cell that's dedicated to overthrowing the corrupt Egyptian government. So this is different from Azam. He is very focused on the corrupt Egyptian government. So he's arrested, you see him here in one of these courtroom cages after Sadat's assassination, and what he's doing is yelling in English to the journalists, who are we? Telling them what the group is and what they want. He does end up leading Egyptian Islamic Jihad after the group splits with the Islamic group. So eventually, he has to flee Egypt because the Mubarak government does not want him in the country. They want to arrest him. They want him in the country, but in jail, and maybe even dead. So he flees to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that's where he meets Abdullah Azam and also Osama bin Laden, who was a very young former business student helping Azam to organize these Arab combat units. Now, Zawahiri does disagree with Azam about the idea of an external enemy, that you're supposed to be trying to reconquer territory from whoever. Christian regimes in various countries, corrupt Muslim regimes. He very much wants, he's really focused on the corrupt Egyptian regime above all. And he kind of wants to take the emphasis off Afghanistan and go back to Egypt and get Mubarak. So it's kind of ironic that of all of them, only he survives, and he's still, we think, in Afghanistan or Pakistan. The big turning point for him comes in 1998 when he merges Egyptian Islamic Jihad with al-Qaeda. So it all becomes al-Qaeda in 1998, and that is the same year that al-Qaeda bombs the embassies, the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. So Osama bin Laden, we all know what happened to him in the end, so I'm not even going to go over that. He comes from a very different background from Azam or Zawahiri. He's not really one of these kind of intellectuals who joined the Muslim Brotherhood. He comes from a very wealthy Saudi construction firm family, the Bin Laden construction group. They're still there. They've disowned him and disavowed him. He's very much set against his own corrupt Arab regime, the Saudi royal family. And after kind of giving up the engineering life, he goes to Afghanistan, and that's where he meets Azam, and he helps him set up these Arab combat units to fight alongside but separately from the Afghan Mujahideen. He is the al-Qaeda person who forms a close relationship with the Taliban. Makes them dependent on al-Qaeda is more accurate, at least as of the late 1990s. And as you just saw, he combines forces with Zawahiri in 1998. And it was often thought while bin Laden was still alive that Zawahiri was really the evil genius behind the two, and bin Laden was kind of like the money bags and the figurehead. Al-Qaeda, as you probably know, has many regional offshoots. These are just the main ones. And where does the Islamic State fit in all this? It is kind of sort of an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda. It starts with this man up on top, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who's actually originally from Jordan, but he's active in Iraq, and he forms his own jihadi group, title of which translates to Union for Unitarianism, like stress on the absolute unity of God and jihad in 1999, and then he affiliates with al-Qaeda in 2004, and his group becomes al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. But then he has some differences with Zawahiri. Ayman al-Zawahiri tells Zarqawi that he's too violent. And when the leader of al-Qaeda tells you you're too violent, that's saying something. In his punishment of wrongdoers as he sees them and so on. So he kind of sort of breaks with al-Qaeda in 2006 and founds the Islamic State in Iraq. But he is killed in 2006 by, I believe it's a drone strike, an American drone strike. So then, he's kind of a bouncer figure, kind of thuggish, a muscle man. He's replaced in the leadership of the Islamic State in Iraq by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's much more of the Zawahiri Azam type of person. He's more of an intellectual, highly educated in Islamic law, kind of a theologian. And he becomes the leader in 2010. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is not his real name. This is apparently his real name. If I have time, I'll get to why he's called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in a minute. As you probably know, the Islamic State attempted to found a state in 2013, and they actually, for a while, were doing quite well with its capital, de facto capital in the city of Raqqa in Syria. You can barely see it on this map. It's up in the north. And these yellow circles, this is a map as of the end of March. The yellow circles are around Palmyra and Ramadi, which Syrian government forces have since taken back. And what you're seeing there, this is an Armenian church, actually, that ISIS, they put up this kind of black superstructure because their color is black, and now it's the ministry of, the office of proselytizing in Raqqa. So I wanted, this is near the last slide, if not the last. I wanted to say something about what I call ISIS style, why they have the symbolism that they do. And much of this is shared by al-Qaeda. They do have an idea of themselves as recreating the original Muslim community, but their idea of the original Muslim community is what I might call comic book style, not to disparage it, but just to point out that it's very cut and dry. You know, it's not, there's not very much room for nuance or complexity or, gee, we don't really know what they were doing. After all, it was 1,400 years ago and the source base dates from 150 years later. None of that. It's very clear to them what the original Muslim community was like. They have a kind of rosy view of it. Kind of rosy, very rosy view of it. They tend to, in their personal names and the names that they use for modern day countries, they deliberately go back to the medieval names. So the map of the world according to ISIS, Spain, for example, is called Al-Andalus, the name for Muslim Spain. Many of the current nation-state divisions basically don't exist. Their own personal names, they tend to use, like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, they tend to use place name adjectives for what amounts to a last name. So Baghdadi tells you he's from Baghdad. The Abu Bakr part, that's to emphasize that he's the caliph, because Abu Bakr, the historical Abu Bakr in the 7th century, was the first caliph, the first successor to Muhammad as leader of the Muslim community. So he very deliberately chose that name because he knew he was going to declare himself the new caliph, the first caliph since the last Ottoman caliph in 1924. The ISIS color is black, and that's very much based on the Abbasid Caliphate, which came to power in 750 of the Common Era and founded Baghdad as its capital. Their official color was black. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi announced his new caliphate, and he called himself Caliph Ibrahim, which to me sounds kind of like King Ralph or something like that, but Ibrahim the Caliph. The first Abbasid Caliph was named Ibrahim. He's wearing black robes, much like the Abbasids, and he's in the mosque of Nuruddin ibn Zangi, who was a great crusader fighter. He defeated his father, Zangi, threw the crusaders out of Edessa, the northernmost crusader state. So to be making this announcement in Nuruddin's mosque while wearing black and having the name Abu Bakr and calling yourself Caliph Ibrahim is hugely symbolic. Just to look at the banners, the Islamic State's banner is in this kind of almost pre-calligraphic Arabic script, whereas Jabhat al-Nusra's is all calligraphed out. And then Shiite banners they're colorful and have the images of Shiite heroes, whereas you would never see a human figure on one of these Sunni revivalist banners. Okay, and finally, the big context. There's always a context, like an underlying structure to what's driving these new movements, relatively new movements. For one thing, throughout this region, you're looking at monolithic dictatorial regimes in Egypt, in Syria, not so much in Afghanistan maybe, but a litany of invasions and warlords and so on, that don't allow for meaningful political participation. One thought I've had is that, you know, the 20th century realities in the area, the nation states created mainly by Britain and France after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, it's kind of like the Soviet Union, which lasted really only during the 20th century and not even for all of that. Maybe we've just come to the end of those 20th century anomalies and something was bound to take their place. And then of course you have the more immediate factor of Saudi financial support for this kind of puritanical Sunnism. Of course, the Saudis are not friends of the Islamic State or al-Qaeda, but ironically, their support of Wahhabism has really fed into these movements. It's kind of like it's come back to bite them. Demographic realities. When I I try and tell undergraduates what's the major difference between the Middle East now and the Middle East maybe 1,000 years ago, the first thing I always say is the population density is many, many, many times greater. And I think that has an effect. It may sound kind of Malthusian, but more competition for scarcer resources. In most of these societies, the demographic that ISIS and al-Qaeda recruit, it's the same people who movie makers want to get into the cinemas. You know, it's like young men between 15 and 30. They're mostly underemployed or unemployed in these countries. I don't like to overuse the word rage, but they have a lot of dissatisfaction with the lack of opportunity. And in Europe in particular, not so much in North America, but in Europe, France, especially France, but also England, Germany, Belgium, etc., they're not well assimilated. You know, they could be second or third generation, and they still may not speak the country's language, French, German, whatever, Dutch, all that well. Their parents don't speak it at all, maybe. They don't feel that they have a stake in the future of the country where they live. And then there's the environmental realities, climate change in the region. The Syrian civil war broke out after Syria had been through an unprecedented 4-year drought that had seen a lot of internal migration from country to city. When you get that kind of concentration of rural people who, all things being equal, tend to be more conservative in these big alienating cities, you know, you kind of get a base of support for these more conservative movements. The alienation plays into it. And when ISIS started to expand in 2014, when it was really just taking territory nonstop, the things they went after first were oil fields and dams, because they know that that's what the kind of existential competition is going to be for, resources. So, yeah, that is finally it. And we have maybe a little time for questions.
What does the ISIS flag say?
Oh, what does it
What
say?
does words say? What?
Yeah, you read up from the bottom. Muhammad is the prophet of God, and then at the top there is no God but God.
Thank you. And what's the difference between ISIS and ISIL?
Yeah, those are English language acronyms. ISIS is Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. ISIL is Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And then this is the Arabic acronym. It's Dawla al-Arabiya fil Iraq wa Sham, or Daesh. And what they call themselves, I guess they just call themselves Islamic State. Yes.
I know you deliberately kind of moved away from Shiism, but I'm just curious, what is it about Shiism that makes it not like this, that they don't have these kind of movements?
Well, 30 years ago, everybody thought that Shiites were the radicals. It was Iran's revolutionary decade, and they were the people hijacking planes and taking hostages. But I'm not saying they aren't radical in quotation marks. But their idea of the ideal society, for 12er Shiites anyway, is for the 12th Imam, who disappeared in the 10th century, to come back. They see him as a messianic figure. There is a heavily messianic and utopian element to al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I'm not saying there's not, but the 12er Shiite form of messianism is very specifically linked to the 12th Imam. And the way 12er Shiism has developed in Iran since the 16th century, when Iran became Shiite, there's a much more rigid sort of clerical hierarchy that you don't have in Sunni Islam, and their idea of an ideal society has a lot more to do with that clerical hierarchy, with a few differences. There's always, footnote, well, not everyone believes that, and there is this kind of anti-clerical strain in Iran even today, but for simplicity's sake, I'll say that. Yes, sir.
You said the Muslim Brotherhood has representation in the Jordanian parliament. I think I read something the other day, that the Jordanian government just closed the Muslim Brotherhood offices in Amman. Is that right?
That could well be, because they arrested, about a year ago, they arrested the leader of the party, and I think they finally let him out. But the Jordanian monarchy is extremely nervous. not so much because of the Brotherhood per se, but because of ISIS and whatever's going on in Iraq and Syria. So yeah, that, you know, this is not my own research. I'm writing a book on the chief eunuch of the Ottoman harem, so I don't really keep my finger on the pulse of Jordanian politics, I have to admit. But yeah, I'm sure you're right.
I'm
Yes,
curious about if there is any connection, particularly when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, that's showing up in the 20s, of association with communist or strong unionist ideas that are occurring in the world at that time. You have revolution in Ireland in the 20s that's heavily related to ideas of land and state, and then you got the Russian Revolution. And
yeah, I'd say, I don't think they themselves are linked to like the Socialist International or anything. Actually, Nasser does more of that. You know, he is the father of Arab socialism, but it's secular Arab socialism, and he's a co-founder of the non-aligned movement. In that interwar period, it's very interesting actually. There is this kind of social justice movement, pretty much worldwide, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, but there's also a kind of authoritarian movement, even quasi-fascistic. There's an outfit in Egypt, the Egyptian youth, in the 1930s, and you know, they have their rather Nazi-like uniforms, and it's like in virtually every society, we can even say, not every society, but in Europe, in the Third World, etc., there are these kind of authoritarian youth groups. In Egypt, in countries like Hungary, where it is actually fascistic, Croatia, also fascistic. So it's a moment where there are all these ideologies that to us today seem oppositional that are at play, and the same kinds of people, disillusioned youth, are joining them. So I guess you could make an analogy to the kinds of people who join Islamic revivalist groups today.
I guess just in terms of, he's a school teacher, so he's probably fairly well read, so he's familiar with these movements, even if he's not directly involved with them, and he's couching them in some sort of Islamist view, and if he's for workers' rights and jobs. I mean, these are all issues that are going on in the 20s and 30s that in some places cause revolution, and in some places create political parties and things like that.
Yeah, well, and also these movements tend to have a strong social justice element anyway, even today. You know, much is made of the fact that Islam is seen as an egalitarian religion, not wedded to social hierarchies the way Christianity is portrayed as being, the way it developed historically, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, sir.
Your presentation here has been focused on Arabs of the Sunni ilk. But if you look at the Middle East, it seems like Egypt, Turkey, Iran, that places that have had civilization and even government for a long time don't seem to be producing people who are as unpredictable and violent and wild as some of the countries maybe that are sort of artificial, like Iraq or Jordan, drawn back that envelope after the colonial days. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting idea, and I've heard that argument's been made by some of the people in the countries concerned. I'm not sure if you look, someone like Ayman al-Zawahiri, I mean, he's about as Egyptian as you can get. And in addition, like the nation state of Jordan, as you say, was pretty much drawn on the back of an envelope, but there's certainly been civilization in the region for thousands of years, just not right within those borders. So I think you could find a number of exceptions to that idea guess I tend to think more in terms of deep underlying structures, like, but at the same time not acknowledging that these are modern issues. They don't go back hundreds and certainly not thousands of years. You know, Islam is an old religion, but these movements are modern. I don't think, if only for reasons of population density, I don't think this same incarnation of Islamic revivalism would have been possible 300, 400 years ago. Another incarnation, yes, but not this one.